I was born on July 3rd, 1935, in Oakland, California, and they named me Joan Eleanor Rose.
I'm Leslie Joan the First. July the 25th, 1935 was a hot, sultry summer day in southern Illinois. And I was born at a farmhouse 5 miles south of Greenville, Illinois.
My grandparents were married in Oakland, but they originally came from different places. My grandmother came from Petaluma. Her father was involved with construction of some kind. He put the first lights around Lake Merritt, and he evidently was involved with politics as well. Somehow they met in Oakland and they were married in about 1906. My grandfather was a policeman, and he was down in 7th Street in Oakland. My grandfather was an interesting man. He was born in San Francisco and lived all around the Bay Area. At one time he lived in San Jose, and at that time San Jose was kind of a mixed bag of people, and he would go into one house on his street and they would be speaking, well, his native tongue was Spanish, and he didn't speak English till he went to school when he was about 7. But he would go into one house and they'd be speaking Italian. The next house they'd be speaking Portuguese or French or Italian or whatever. And he picked up all those languages. He was fluent in any one of those languages at any time. He was a very kindly person. He never raised his voice. He never got mad. I would bake these horrible cakes. I guess they were horrible, but he'd always tell me how wonderful they were, and they were better than this fancy bakery that he used to go to, and he liked his sweets. My grandma was probably the power behind the throne, but she was the disciplinarian, and we spent a lot of time with Grandma. Because I was very close to her, they lived 4 or 5 houses up the street, and she was always home. And she taught me how to embroider, how to sew, how to play solitaire. I loved to sew right from the time I was a little kid during the Second World War. You couldn't just go down and buy clothes. She would make things for me, and I always would be with her when she was sewing, because the sewing room was right in the back of the house. And I was learning how to can, how to cook, how to do dishes, everything, while I was staying with her. And my mother was very special to me, and she was this very special person. She was born in Oakland in 1908, in West Oakland, and she liked to read and to do other things, and she took care of us. She was in the picture, but not with a huge amount of influence in the regard where she was teaching us a lot all the time. She was always big on education, and she would teach us things that we had to know, but she wasn't one that would sit down and teach us a nursery rhyme or something like that. My father was probably a bigger influence than my mother, because he was the one that would teach us nursery rhymes and how to tell time and catechism lessons and so forth like that, whereas my mother was busy taking care of the house. My mother was very volatile. She was, you wouldn't know it if you talked to her because she was a quiet person, but when she had a temper and she let go, she really let go. My brother George was born after my cousin, and we all got along fine for a while, but then things started to happen, and my mother and father were not getting along so well, so she asked him to leave. My brother and I were very upset. It was very upsetting to us because my dad was a good dad, and we loved him. It was hard because we were just young kids, and we couldn't understand what had happened. I remember sitting at the top of the stairs crying. We had a 2-story house, and they were down at the bottom of the stairs, and we were at the top, and both of us we were crying because we were very sad. I was probably only 6 or 7, and he was 2.5 years younger, so we were just kids. But he would come by every Friday night to see us, and then we would go out on Sundays with him. Wherever we wanted to go, he would take us anywhere we wanted to go. If it was bike riding around Lake Merritt, horseback riding at Mills College, ice skating at Iceland, to see the newsreel, to see a movie. I love my father. He was a good person. My mother still needed a job, and she'd always been interested in the law. Of course, her father was a policeman. She applied for the job as a probation officer. So she met lots of people who needed help in her office as a probation officer. One of those people was a woman called Vadna. Now, Vadna had graduated from Cal and was a very popular young woman at the time. She went to her father, to Vadna's father, and asked him to help her. But my mother became friends with her father, and eventually they married. And we moved up to his house, and it was, as I look back on it, it was probably quite an adjustment for him. He'd been married to his first wife for a long time, and she'd passed away. But he hadn't had kids around him, and when he did have kids, he had 2 girls who were properly behaved, not like my brother and me, who had been kind of left on our own a lot of the time. My mother, she was crazy about George. My aunt told me that George was her favorite. I never believed that because I always thought I was her favorite. But anyway. It was hard for George because he was kind of used to being footloose and fancy-free, and to have someone that expected him to be quiet around the house and to behave all the time, that wasn't him. Anyway, he turned out great. He was a great brother. We got along just fine. As a student at Anna Head's, we were about 2 blocks away from Cal, and we'd go up there and study. We'd wear a coat over our awful gray uniforms. We had these old gray skirts and sweaters that matched, and they were from the 20s, I swear. We hated them, and we wore coats over them even in hot days because we didn't want anyone to know that we were from that school and we were wearing those awful uniforms. I wouldn't wear gray for years after that.
Well, the Inlow family basically came from Holland, Amsterdam, and Hendricks Inlow and his brother came over and settled on the Delaware River. They bought their land from Lord Baltimore, and that was in 1660s. And then after 1 or 2 generations, they spread down to the Carolinas, and from the Carolinas they moved into the other southern states and into the Midwest, and the ones that were on my side came into Illinois. We've been there since the 1700s. We have a urban story that maybe Abraham Lincoln was really an Abraham Inlow because supposedly Nancy Hanks lived with the Abraham Inlows in western North Carolina near the Ompaloofa Valley for some time. And he was very prominent with the Cherokee Indians. He and the chief knew each other and so forth, and the Indians thoroughly believed that he was the father of Abraham Lincoln. So that's a story that permeates the history of our family. The 2 people that influenced me really were my mother and my grandfather. My grandfather, who really was my true role model, he was a person that I really loved and I really respected. In fact, he's the reason I became a doctor. When I was about 4 years old, he got sick. We would go over and stay with him, and the old country doctor, the same doctor that had delivered me, came out and saw my grandfather. And the next morning I got up as a little boy and nosy and was coming down the stairs, and my grandmother was making breakfast and the doctor was still there. He got well over the next week, and since he was my idol, I was very proud of that doctor, and I said, someday I'm going to be like him. And so from that point on, I really said that that's what I was going to do the rest of my life. It was a thing that a lot of people sort of didn't think much of, because when you talked about me going in to become a doctor, it was, yeah, sure, he'd be like all the rest of the family. He was a man who didn't have an 8th grade education, but he was a very good farmer. He was smart. He had common sense. He gave me 4 principles to live by. He said, you respect your neighbor. However, if your neighbor ever does anything bad to you, that doesn't hold, number 1. Number 2 is, anytime your neighbor needs help, you help him. The third thing was basically, no matter what you do, whether you're cleaning out the barn or you're doing something at school, you do the best you can. You don't shirk. And number 4, when you work for somebody, you give them an honest day's work for an honest day's pay. And those have been 4 principles I've lived by. So I really, he was a very important person. I'm very proud that I had him. I've probably lived and seen things that most people have only heard about or read about, truthfully. I lived during the Depression and World War II. My father was a sharecropper. My mother was a housewife. 2 months after I was born, my father went out to cut corn for the cows. The neighbor noticed that unlike things that would be expected, the horses stayed in one area for an awful long time. So he walked over to the field and he found my father laying beside the wagon. The corn knife was still in his hand. He was dead. He was 27 years old. So I never knew my father. After a few months, we moved in with his parents. Didn't work out that well. They didn't have a big house. He still had 1 daughter at home. My grandfather was renting a farm from a Presbyterian minister, 400 acres, and it had on it a 3-room house that had been a place for the previous renter to have a hired hand. My grandfather didn't need a hired hand. He had 3 sons, and the little house that they'd used to store corn in, so they cleaned it up and took the tops off of tin cans and nailed them over the holes that the rats and the mice that came through, and put down some linoleum and fixed it up, and that little 3-room house became our place of residence for the next 10 plus years of my life. No electricity, no indoor plumbing, no central heating, but we managed, and my mother was a very good cook, and she took good care of us. But life in that little 3-room house was very important. I was sort of an obnoxious little boy who tried to get his way. In fact, I had a habit of having temper tantrums, which I would hold my breath. My mother and my grandmother, I'd scare them to death, and they'd usually give in. My grandfather happened to catch me in one of them one day, though. So he walked over by a peach tree, took a little branch off of it, which was sort of very thin and about like a whip. And after a couple of strikes to my legs, I came out of my temper tantrum, and I never had them after that. So he trained me pretty well in many things. I appreciated what I got from him.
In those days, kids didn't make up their mind about what school they went to. They went to where their parents thought they should go. I transferred because I'd gone to 4 years of girls' school before Mills College, and then Mills College was all girls except for graduate students. But otherwise, we were kind of just all girls. I mean, there's another part of life besides girls. So I finished up at Mills and then went down to USC.
I had a scholarship from Mount San Antonio, and I had planned to go to UCLA, but I stopped by SC on the way back to my uncle's. And in those days, SC was not nearly the campus it's in. A lot of their buildings were the old barracks from World War II. And in fact, the registrar's office was in one of them. So I went there and asked if I could see someone in embryology or comparative anatomy. And the lady that dealt with me said, "Do you have an appointment?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, let me see what I can do." And so I went over to the old science building, which had been built in the early 1900s. And as I walked up the steps, I thought to myself, this looks like the high school that I graduated from, which was built in 1909. The stairs were swayed and used and so forth. And I said, I just left a beautiful campus over in Westwood, and I came here. So I had really doubts, well, this was a very good decision. So I went up and knocked on the door, and the secretary let me in. And after a short time, she let me in to see Dr. Martin. So I walk out after the interview, and I was very impressed. And I looked who Dr. Martin is. He was head of the department. And I thought to myself, I spent half a day at UCLA. I didn't get to talk to a professor. I come over here without an appointment, and I talk to the head of the department. I'm going to SC. So that night at dinner with my grandmother and my uncle, I said, "I changed my mind. I'm going to USC." And that impression and that feeling never left me. As I was finishing med school, I got involved with the fundraiser for Ben-Hur. I got my picture taken with Charlton Heston, put in the LA Times. And from that point on, I spent a lot of my life supporting my university, serving on different boards, and helping establish club projects, raising money for scholarships and so on. So it gave me a bug. I've been fundraising for SC since 1959.
Joe was pre-med, and he was in class with my friend who was in the sorority with me, Sally MacArthur. And he got admitted. He was the first one in his class to get admitted to med school, and he wanted to celebrate. So he told Sally to fix him up with a date. So she said to him, "What do you want, a redhead, a blonde, or brunette, whatever?" He said, "Well, it's up to you. You just take care of it." And so Sally and her boyfriend and Joe and I were supposed to go to the circus, the Shrine Circus.
When I showed up, I met my wife-to-be, and she was everything that I could think about.
Joe got to the sorority, and Sally said, "Well, I can't go. Neil can't get off. He had to pick up a body." He worked for a mortuary, so that was one of the things he had to do. Joe said, "Oh, no." He said, "That's fine. I'll take you both."
My uncle, who was a school teacher and with whom I lived, said the next day, "How was your date?" And I said, "I don't know. She was really beautiful, but she had the most beautiful eyes I've ever seen." You know, it was unbelievable that I was in med school to start with. And the first 2 years were basic science. And SC did not have a actual medical school at that point, a building. The first 2 years were on campus in the science building, but you still didn't have a building over on by the hospital. Our buildings in 1956 to 1960 were Quonset huts at the outside of the old LA County Hospital. The first medical bag I had was a large one. Joan's mother had gotten it for me as a present for going to med school, and it was one of the big ones that you opened up, and it had compartments and so forth. It was twice the size of the one that I have on my lap, and it was like a symbol of something. I could remember the bag that the old doctor had that came out to see my grandfather. It was a bag like he had, and it was very impressive that I was able to carry this bag now, and it made you feel like you had arrived, would be the word to say. And I have to tell a funny story about that. The first night I was on, I was used to staying up because I worked railroad dock while I was going to college, and so sometimes I got maybe 2 or 3 hours sleep in a day's time. But for some reason, I'd been up all night, hadn't had a nap or anything, and I went out to my car, and I set my bag down by the car, opened the door, got in, and started to back up and hit something. I'd forgotten my bag. And I just barely touched it. Thank goodness it didn't damage. But that was a little story as far as my first doctor's bag I actually ran into with the car because I'd forgotten to put it in the car after I went out to the car.
Our firstborn is Leslie Joseph Enlow. He was named after his father. He became very outgoing, and he was a good kid. He would get into little bits of trouble all along. For instance, when he was a senior in high school, they got a keg, and they had it on the senior lawn. The principal came out and said, "You can't have that on the lawn." They said, "Well, it's just got lemonade in it. Doesn't matter." So they took it across the street. But it was always some little incident like that he would be getting in trouble for. Well, he was a smart kid, and he always did well in school. He went to DVC and studied cinema there, and then he went to USC and was a cinema major, and he loved it. He still loves it.
Most of the time, I was at the hospital, so basically his mother got the phone call, and she finally told the principal, she said, "I hope every time that something happens down at that high school, you don't call me and think that Les was the one that did it."
He's a good person, and he's very proud of his family. He's got a very nice family. He's got 4 children, 2 grandchildren.
He's a very caring person. He's an honest person. In spite of all his mischievous things, he's never been in any real trouble, and I think that that's all that you can hope for in this day and age, that you grow up to be a person that cares and is honest. Well, we had to move to Texas to get a daughter. She's the Yellow Rose of Texas. She was born while I was stationed at Brooke Army Hospital down in San Antonio, Texas. And
10th day of temperatures over 100.
Yeah, she was always wanting to help. She saw that I needed a screwdriver, she ran and she brought me the screwdriver. So Tracy was always wanting to do what she could to help me, and she was always volunteering for things. So that was a very early trait that she, and like her brother, she got involved with things and was very, very much the leader. In fact, the two of them were, when she was in 7th grade and he was in 8th grade, the school district decided that the population in Orinda was getting small, so they were going to take the 2 intermediate schools and combine them. And so the principals came and said, "Now, you cannot have your mascots and you cannot have your colors. You've got to come up with something that's different." It turned out that there was a student teacher or a person who had finished at SC who happened to be going to both schools. And our kids were very noted to be SC. In fact, in territory that's Stanford and Cal, when there was an SC game, they wore their SC paraphernalia to school. So he came to him and he said, if you will get them to choose such and such at your school, I'll influence the other school. And believe it or not, in Cal, Stanford territory, the kids wound up choosing Trojans as their mascot and Cardinal and Gold as their colors. And people said, I can't understand how our kids could do that. And they accused us. We didn't even know it was happening. That was between Tracy and Les, who they came up with that idea.
Jerry considers himself our go-to guy for problems with our computer especially, but for a lot of other things that he helps us move and et cetera. Whenever we have a problem, we call Jerry.
I had a real chance to see Bethany and Sean grow up from the time they were small children to where they are now college graduates. And it's been nice having Tracy and Jerry and Beth and
Tara. Tara's Jerry's daughter.
We enjoyed having that experience. Been a blessing to have them around.
Sean was number 3, Sean Evan, and he was born about 3 years after Tracy, and she kind of took over taking care of him when he was a little guy. But after having 2 that were kind of rambunctious, especially number 1, Sean was so quiet I would have to wake him up to feed him practically. He never made a peep, and he's still very quiet. He's a very nice kid. He played the saxophone in school, and very, very intelligent, and he's a pathologist. Sean is a very caring person. He volunteers for a lot of things.
He's a person who basically is very content within himself. Mm-hmm. He is not like all 3 of the other kids. He is bright. He's probably in the genius category. He finds good in everyone.
I've never heard him put down anybody in all these years. He never says a bad thing.
He finds it very difficult to basically condemn people.
Okay, so the 4th child, the baby.
Oh.
No, the baby.
Oh.
Greg. He was rambunctious. He loved sports from the beginning. He was the only kid of my 3 sons that could beat me in basketball. He could study, but that was not his forte. He was able to succeed in what he wanted to do, but it was not always by being industrious, at least in the sense that we would think. But like all of the kids, he was honest, except when it
some of the time.
except sometimes when he was pushed to the test. But as he grew up, he and his friends, if we went on a trip, they knew where the liquor cabinet was, but if they were going to use the liquor, they made sure that they watered it down by putting it back up to about where it was. He could skirt the truth without being completely lying, but he knew how to manipulate.
He got so he could write my name so that it would pass at school. So he would write a note to get out of something that he was supposed to be doing. He was good at analyzing.
He was good at analyzing. He was very good at dissecting sports and so forth. In fact, he pursued being an athletics. He worked his way up to being an associate athletic director. Like all the other children, he, in spite of his shenanigans, he's an honest person.
His kids were always tops with him, and they're very close to their father.
He said 3 children who looked to him as the person that they respected. All of our kids at times did things, but none of them ever got into trouble with drugs. never got in really trouble with the law. They grew up to be solid citizens that we were proud of that they are.
At first, we would fly to Illinois because that's where Joe's family is. And then it got to taking the car back, and it would vary between the car and flying back and forth to Illinois. And then from Illinois, we would go to other places.
The United States is such a diverse country, and kids talked about, well, going to Europe and so on. I said, no, before you ever go a place, you need to learn about this country. So we designed through the years the United States in 4 sections. Because of the geography, we could winding up in Illinois. And so the kids got to see every state, all 48 states, before they ever graduated from high school. But it was important because they saw differences, they saw people, they saw different customs. When we did these trips with a car, I had a technique. We had a big station wagon, Caprice, Chevrolet, one of the biggest that they made. We'd plan the trip so we stopped someplace where there was something to see by about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so we never made reservations ahead of time. So we'd get there early enough to book into a motel and then go to whatever the site was we were going to. It was a cave or whatever it was. But they knew that, and we tried to get a place with a swimming pool. So
Yeah.
the kids could use a little of that extra energy that they'd bottled up while they were riding. But they knew the next morning we were going to get up at about 4 o'clock, maybe 4:30, and they were going to sleep again while I drove for a couple hours and put in maybe 100, 200 miles. So our trips were very well planned. They remember they were very regimented, commander, and made sure that everybody was on target. So the kids remember those trips. They were hectic. When's the next gas station? How long is it before we get to such and such? So they had the questions, but they really did pick up a lot of the history and the things that are important to the United States. As a little boy, I was staying at our grandparents', and he was very sick, and an old country doctor came out and stayed all night to help him get better. And I was so impressed, since my grandfather was sort of my idol, that I swore that I was going to be like him someday. And I was 5 years old at the time, and I never gave up that dream. Things fell in the right places. Teachers, wife, and so forth helped me achieve that. And by achieving that, I was able to become not just a physician, but a general surgeon. And it helped me to set up a practice that I would have for 44 years. It was important. I never gave up the fact that I was a doctor first and a surgeon second. Sometimes it's not the medical thing you do, but how you listen to a person, how you show them empathy, you show them concern, is going to make a big difference in how they feel. And that was the joy of medicine. I thoroughly enjoyed medicine, still do, even though I'm not as active as I was at that time. It was a goal that I was very proud that I was able to achieve. You have to focus on what's important in life, and it's not material things. It's a concept of doing things and sharing and going forward. Yeah, you say, okay, you had patches on your jeans, but that didn't seem to affect me. It didn't stop me from studying. It didn't stop me from achieving what I wanted to do or to think. So I think if we focus too much on material things, it takes away from our being able to focus on what is really meaningful to us. I was fortunate enough to marry a woman who basically, she's a very compassionate person. Our kids for a while said that they didn't realize her name was not Damn It Joan. But she was there for me. When things were really tight with me and so forth, she backed me up. She's an amazing woman. And having that backing, you know, it's just one of those things that you just look back and say, gosh, how fortunate I was to meet a person like that. That's my backbone.